My mother is a primary school teacher in a rural town in Australia. About 10 years ago, she was offered the principal position at a tiny mountain school about an hour away from where we lived. This mountain town was kind of a long-running joke for us townies. Just mentioning it would cause any local to start humming the dueling banjos theme from Deliverance. The population was just under 40 people. Most of them had the same last name, and they were all pretty well known for keeping it in the family. However, being promoted from teacher to principal was a pretty big deal for my mom. We decided we'd all live at the old schoolhouse during the week and come back to civilization on the weekends. When we arrived, I was shocked at just how small this town actually was. One street surrounded by thick scrub and brushland, dilapidated houses tucked away out of sight from the main road. No streetlights, no shops. The school was tiny, with only about 14 kids in total, and all related to each other in some way. I hate to say it, but some of the students had that Innsmouth look, if you know what I mean, that only comes with generations of kissing cousins. But overall, they were all really nice actually. All the kids behaved well, and my mom enjoyed her new job a lot. I had just finished high school and was waiting for university to start, so I spent most of my days alone in the schoolhouse reading or cooking, while my siblings were away at school and my parents were at work. However, as the weeks progressed, I found myself spending more and more time at the school itself helping mom, because I just couldn't stand being alone there. With no TV reception and only an old Walkman and some shitty cassette tapes to fill the silence, I found myself rapidly fluctuating between bored and extremely paranoid most of the time. There were always a lot of sudden and random old house noises that really didn't sound like they were the house at all. Scratching, shuffling sounds at odd times that frequently sounded like footsteps or perhaps even voices. I tried to pass it off as paranoia for as long as I could, but shit finally hit the fan one day. I had just happened to stop my tape mid-song when I distinctly heard a man's voice quietly whispering random numbers from the front veranda. 40, 40, 9, 40, 17. I ain't afraid of no ghosts, but I am afraid of hillbilly home invasions, so I took off to the school and reported it to my mother, who of course did not believe me. Then I went to my father, who didn't believe me either. My sister did though, at least. She said she hadn't slept well since she was awoken nights before by the sound of a branch scraping on her bedroom window. Only catch was, there was no tree around. She told me she thought she had seen a man standing in the backyard late one night too, but when she mustered the courage to look once more, he was gone. Pretty soon, we were the first teenage sisters to ever insist upon sharing a room together. My parents both thought we were being ridiculous. However, one evening after dinner, we were visited by two of the local men who told them something that changed their mind. After asking if we'd had any trouble at the house, they proceeded to tell us that everyone in town had been experiencing trouble for over a month now. Apparently, these men dressed in makeshift camouflage gear had been wandering down along the main street at night. It came to the town's attention because while the town was used to strangers in hunting gear, these guys were covered in leaves and grass and sticks. No one knew who they were. Definitely not the locals of the town. There were at least 10 different people, always traveling alone and always dressed in that same weird camouflage clothing. At first, the locals of the town were just having a laugh about it. It certainly wasn't common to see people dressed as walking bushes outside of a Warner Bros. Cartoon, even during hunting season. It was very absurd and funny, at least at first, until these guys started sneaking onto private property. One lady had woken up to find something moving under her house, shining a flashlight up through the floorboards. Another man had come home to find a camouflaged guy hiding crouched on his roof. One man heard muttering from his back porch, only to go out and discover that someone had unchained his hunting dogs from their run and tied them to his back doorknob, then drawn a large X on the door. Pretty much every local had been terrorized by one of these guys in the night, and some of them even brazenly during the day. The local guys were really nice actually, and warned my dad to keep things locked up tight and stay vigilant, and let them know if anything happened. Over the course of the next month, many similar events occurred. My mother even saw one of the men hiding on the edge of the school grounds during the day and called the police. The sightings were frequent, as were the chalk X's. One of the locals even saw a man in camouflage standing on his front lawn whimpering like an animal in the early hours of the morning. The local guy who'd seen him threatened him while his wife called the police, but the man silently stood his ground, smiling at them in the dark. The local man eventually lost his cool and beat the heck out of this creeper, who stood there smiling and laughing through the entire beating, then just got up and walked calmly back into the bush, still smiling and even bleeding before the police arrived. Unfortunately, there's not really a cool ending to this story. The school closed not long after due to government funding cuts, and my mom got a new job closer to home, which meant we left pretty quickly. We moved back home after spending only 5 months up in mountain country, and no one in the family was too sorry about that. I often wonder who those guys were to be out there in the middle of nowhere, and why were they doing all of that exactly? A few years ago, I was leaving my grad school office late, around 10 p.m. to catch the bus home. I walked from the university campus via relatively busy, well-lit streets to the main north-south road in my area of the city. I was waiting for the bus at a shelter, as it was in the middle of winter and snowing. It was fairly cold. The bus ran about every 15 minutes, so I wasn't really worried or nervous or anything, just kind of patiently waiting there to get on my way home. I was listening to my music with my headphones in when I noticed a guy walk up to the shelter. I looked at him briefly, did that little Canadian half smile of acknowledgement, and went right back to listening to my music and reading through Reddit. A few minutes passed by and I could hear him start talking to me now. Well, I assumed it must be me. I was the only one around. I looked up and the man was staring at me, smiling a bit oddly and speaking to me as well. I took out my headphones. Excuse me? He kept on smiling and blathering on, asking me about my day, the weather, what I like to do, etc. I don't know what it is about me, or perhaps people in general, but I'm a perennial people pleaser. I don't like confrontation, and my main aim in life seems to be to keep the peace at all times. So I answered a few of his questions politely and as non-specifically as I could, with one of my earbuds still in. He just kept on blathering on and on though. At this point, I just kind of tuned him out and nodded politely. This went on for about 10 minutes, when I just had this sinking feeling in my stomach about this guy. Like I could tell something was just a little bit off now, enough to make me start getting nervous. After about 10 minutes, I could see the bus rolling on its way up, which was a huge relief for me. No one else had arrived at the bus stop that entire time. Luckily, I could see at least 10 to 15 people were already on, which was great for me. I hopped on the bus and sat near the front. The guy sat across from me, so he could keep on talking to me. I had originally intended to head right to my house, to the west of the street I was on, but after this guy decided to be my personal parrot, I decided to go to my boyfriend's instead, pretty much in exactly the opposite direction. I was still getting an uncomfortable feeling from this guy, so I decided I would push the bus stop button a stop early, just to see what this guy would do. The bus came to a stop at my request, and the man got up immediately. I didn't move.
"Oh, isn't this your stop too?"
he asked me. "Oh, whoops, I must have hit the wrong stop button on accident. I'm kinda tired, The man looked at me.
"Oh, well, that's funny. I must have mixed it up too, because this isn't my stop either."
He sat back down right behind me. At this point, I was pretty freaked out. I hit the bus stop for the next stop and texted my boyfriend to come and meet me at 109th Street. I got up to leave once the bus stopped, and the creepy man followed close behind. I crossed the road and he still followed, still jabbering away at me, asking me all kinds of questions. Once I got to the other side of the road, I told him I had to go now, and my boyfriend was meeting up with me. He looked irritated at even the idea of me having a boyfriend and tried to follow me more. I stopped and told him I was going alone from here on out.
"Well, can I have your number?"
he asked. I panicked. I kind of froze. I gave him almost my number, with the last 4 digits completely scrambled around. I read it off to him, said goodnight, and started walking away really quickly. I had almost started running and had made it 20 steps away. I could hear him now jogging after me.
"Hey, I think there was a mix-up. I tried calling that number and it wasn't you."
He jogged right up next to me and was still smiling, that same weird smile, staring at me. How weird," I said, grabbing my phone. I pretended to check it for a missed call and texted my boyfriend that I needed him to come right now. The man leaned in.
"So, what's your real number then?"
he asked. I honestly don't know what I would have done. I think I would have just given it to him. I had no idea what to do. It was extremely cold, it was winter, and it was dark in this tiny residential neighborhood I had entered. I knew I couldn't outrun him. Luckily for me, at that exact moment, my boyfriend came sprinting up. He was fairly large and somewhat imposing. I turned around to the man and said, "Have a good night." I jogged up to my boyfriend and launched myself at him. I didn't look back at the creepy dude, but I did tell my boyfriend to please make sure the doors were all locked and the windows all closed before we went to bed that night. My family grew up in the rural area around where we lived. My parents weren't rich or anything, but we did have a fairly decent life. This was in the 70s or so things were a lot different than they are nowadays. It was a lot more common back then to see someone driving down a country road with an open beer between their legs. Although I don't live out in the country now, nor have I in quite a long time, I at least like to think that things like that don't happen nearly as often anymore. I learned to drive myself when I was about 12 years old. This was not unusual for me or my family. And it wasn't too strange either for one of us to take the car out and go somewhere. I had a lot of friends my age who chewed tobacco as well. I tried it a few times, but I didn't really care for it. Around this time, I was good friends with a guy named Vance. We had grown up in the same general area up on the ridge. Our houses weren't really that close together, but we rode the same school bus to school. We were friends all the way from kindergarten until sometime in high school. The reason the two of us stopped being friends in high school was due to a girl he had liked for years liking me even more. Although I wasn't really interested in her and would never have dated someone my friend had his eye on, this made him really angry. After a while, he just kind of stopped talking to me. A while further after that, he became very antagonistic to me as well, which was pretty horrible because no one wants to lose a friend in a situation like that. It's not like I made the girl like me or something. When I was 17 years old, I was home by myself on a weekend night. I decided to take one of the old cars and see a different buddy of mine who lived a bit further up the ridge than I did. It was about an hour's drive to his house, since it was a dark dirt road the entire way there. You had to be real careful out on some of these roads. They were right on the sides of hills, and there was not anything like a guardrail to keep you from driving off the side and dying. When I left that friend's house to go home, it was already pretty late. I went outside and could see it was actually a little bit foggy out. It was not ideal to drive this path in that weather, but it just meant I would have to take my time and be more careful when driving. However, it was not too long after I'd begun that I noticed some lights behind me. Another vehicle was now coming my way. The road wasn't really wide enough for more than a car and a half, so this person could not pass me by. Still though, he didn't stop at all. He drove up upon me really fast. In fact, just before he slowed down, I almost thought he was going to slam into me and shove me off the cliff. He had gotten as close as possible to hitting me, then backed off just a bit. When this person was about a car's length behind me, he started to flash his high beams on. Then he sped up just enough to almost slam into me again. Just before he'd hit me though, he slowed down. Now, he kept his high beams on, which made it very difficult for me to see the path ahead. I tried to pull my car over just a bit to let this guy pass me by. I was really trying to let him go, assuming that's what he wanted. This guy made no attempt to pass me though. He did the exact same thing, pulled up really close to me, then backed off again. This time, he began to honk his horn angrily as well. I began to get very nervous. Every time this guy repeated this pattern, I got even more scared. I tried to speed up now, which I was very hesitant to do. I didn't like driving fast down these roads, even when there was not any fog. That didn't change anything though. When I sped up, he matched me perfectly. He kept getting close as if he was going to hit me off the side before backing off yet again. He did this over and over while still honking his horn at me. I don't know how long this kept up, but finally we got into the bottom of the hill, so there was no risk of running off the side anymore. We were still in a highly forested area though. Thankfully, by that point, I was not far away from home. I thought I could make it there, and at least I knew my family would be home by then. If this guy followed me all the way home, my brothers would be there to help me kick the crap out of him. No sooner than that thought entered my head, however, the car did its same pattern again. This time though, it did hit me. I reacted by slamming the brakes, which caused my car to spin and skid off the road. The only thing I remember after that was nothing. I woke up in the hospital 3 months after the accident. My car had slammed right into a big tree. I hadn't been wearing my seatbelt in that moment. The only thing that kept me from flying through the windshield was the big steering wheel that my head and chest had bounced off of. I had some pretty bad head injuries, and I had been out for the entire time. I guess I had opened my eyes after a month, but had not been acting like myself. They told me I was aware, but it was like nobody was there. I don't really remember exactly because it was so many decades ago. I had a violent and sort of feral behavior that required me to be restrained to my bed for a while. Then, suddenly one day, the day I felt like I woke up, I just went back to normal. I never found out exactly who was driving that car that rammed me. However, some other people who knew me in high school later told me that Vance had been bragging that it was him after it happened. Vance's dad worked at the police department, so there was never an investigation to see if he had done it. That, of course, convinced me that he had. I don't live out in the country anymore, but I really hope it's harder these days for crooked people to get away with things like that now. I'm a 28-year-old man from England. Near the end of August, I was out with some friends in a bar to celebrate my birthday. It was near the end of the night, and we decided it was time to go home, having been out for about 8 hours going on this point. We were up to the first floor of the bar, and my friends went down the staircase to the main doors ahead of me. For reasons my advanced drunkenness has caused me to forget since, I decided to try taking a shortcut off the stage next to the stairs instead. I'm guessing I just stepped off the stage thinking it was a short drop to the ground. It was closer to about 5 or 6 feet, and I hit the ground dead on with my legs straight and my knees locked. I heard a snap. Well, I knew instantly something was seriously wrong there. Cue a 999 call and a surprisingly calm ambulance ride to the hospital after being dosed up on gas and air. When we arrived, they gave me a thorough x-ray and discovered I'd broken both of my legs like a dumbass. By this point, I'd sort of already guessed though. Your right foot pointing down instead of up is a pretty good indication something's really wrong. My heart sank even further when the attending doctor told me they'd have to admit me ahead of corrective surgery in the next couple of days. By now, they'd given me quite a bit of morphine. I was still huffing gas and air like a champ as well, so I was fairly out of it. A porter wheeled me up to the ward and introduced me to a nurse, who explained I was going to be put into the men's ward, as they'd had to separate genders the previous day into different rooms. Even out of it on pain meds, I remember thinking that was quite a weird thing to mention. My nurse set me up in my room right by the ward entrance. My bed was one of 5 in there and was next to the room's shared toilet/shower room. It was around 5 a.m. now, and the entire place was quiet and dark. As the nurse took me through all the admittance procedures, I could vaguely make out a guy in the opposite bed. Unlike the others in the room, he was awake and sitting up in his bed to watch me being brought in. I couldn't quite see his face, but the patchy white hair on his head was catching the moonlight coming in from the windows, so he must have been an older guy. What struck me as odd, though, was how he was just sitting there, completely still like a statue. No movement, no noise. I couldn't even hear him breathing. He was just sitting there focused on me the entire time. Before the nurse left, I asked him to draw the curtain around me so I would be shielded from view, and eventually I managed to drift off to sleep. I woke up the next day to find my parents had been contacted and were sitting by my bed. Standing next to them was the guy from the bed opposite, chatting away like they'd known each other for years. I'm not exactly known as a people person, and given that for obvious reasons I was quite a touch grouchy, I'll admit that I was annoyed my parents were letting a total stranger stand right over me while I was unconscious. Of course, there's no way they could have really known that he'd creeped me out a little the night before. The man introduced himself. Here we'll call him Mick. He seemed friendly enough, one of those harmless old men who comes across as lonely and is just keen to talk to just about anyone. I found out he was in his early 70s, quite short and round, and was on the ward because he'd fractured his collarbone in a fall. When he eventually wandered off, my parents told me he seemed to be a nice man, confirming he just appeared pleased to have any new people to talk to at all. During the course of that first day, my parents eventually left. The doctors came around to fit me up with splints before my surgery, planned for day 3. They made it clear I'd be in the hospital for at least a week or so, and I would not be walking for a few months at the very least. Not what I wanted to hear. During all of these conversations, Mick was always lurking nearby, listening in. When the doctors left, he came right to my bedside. Rather than stand, he sat down in the chair next to me and asked me to repeat what the doctors had said. I wasn't in much of a mood to chat, and because I got it into my head that he was harmless, I asked why he'd need to know. He'd only been standing a few feet away, and obviously he must have heard everything. The second those words left my lips, though, his entire demeanor changed immediately. The sweet old man that had been sitting in that chair just beside me was gone. His face went blank and flattened out. He fixed me with this strange stare, and one corner of his mouth lifted into a lopsided grin. My wife just died, you know. Again, I'm not a people person, and conversations about death are certainly way outside my wheelhouse. I stuttered a little, trying to find appropriate words. I was starting to say how sorry I was to hear that, and asked how long it had been. Given the odd grin, I guessed it had been quite a while. About 3 weeks, just like that, gone. His face never changed the whole time. It dawned on me now that maybe he was not totally mentally present at that point. He never broke eye contact either, just staring at me grinning. One of those looks that wasn't immediately sinister, but goes on for too long, you know. Thankfully, the nurses came in at that point to serve dinner, and Mick retreated back to his bed. He watched the TV the rest of that day. I put my iPod on so I had an excuse to not make any more conversation. Right then, I just thought he was a little left of normal, and it was more weirdness that I could certainly deal with. When the lights out came around, I asked the nurses to draw the curtains closed around my bed for me. Although I was still in quite a bit of pain, I drifted off early. During the night, though, I was suddenly woken up in what had to have been the early hours of the morning. One of those gradual awakenings where you know something's not quite right, but you're not present enough to work out what yet. The ward was almost totally dark and silent again, especially around my bed with the curtains drawn. I assumed the weird feeling was down to, being in the hospital with 2 graphically shattered legs, and turned my head to the left onto the pillow. Then I nearly rolled off the opposite side in complete shock. Standing inside of the drawn curtains, right next to my bed, was Mick, just standing there watching me sleep, like you do when you've had a shock. I said something stupid. "Hey, this isn't where you sleep." Nothing. That same blank stare, barely a ruler length from my face. I thought he might just be sleepwalking, but he didn't have that glazed over look in his eyes to go with it. He seemed perfectly alert, just happy to stand there observing me. "Mick, how long have you been standing there?" That's when I got a special kind of chill, the kind you get when something really freaks you out. Rather than reply, he smiled so wide. I saw both rows of his teeth. He shuffled back around the curtain to his own bed. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. Because he'd never left the room and I certainly wasn't going to be going anywhere on my own, I couldn't really mention it to the nurses. I did text a few friends who were visiting the next day and told them to watch out for him when they came through. He stayed away during their entire visit though and acted like a normal old innocent man. As the day went on, I decided I must have made more of it than I should have. Perhaps I was just on edge because of what I had going on and being in unfamiliar surroundings. That day, I went in for my surgery. I came to about 6 hours later to find myself hooked up to a morphine pump. As a result, I was completely out of my tree high the entire evening and was in such a good opiate-fueled mood I totally forgot about Mick. Big mistake. It got to the early hours again. I was playing a game on my phone, oblivious. The nurses were checking in every hour or so. They disturbed the curtains around my bed a lot as they'd come and go. The last nurse had left a gap about 6 inches wide where the curtains met, typically right in the part opposite Mick's bed. Mick was normally a very, very loud snorer, so I was reassured by the noises coming from him that he must be asleep at this point. I've got to assume because of the morphine that I stopped paying attention. Suddenly, I realized I was acutely aware that I couldn't hear the snoring any longer. I also couldn't remember how long it had been since I last heard it. Nervously, I looked at the gap between the curtains, but I couldn't make anything out. I was just about to write it off and go back to my game, when just left of the gap, I could hear my name being called out. Not the normal way of saying it, not a whisper, more like a sinister groan almost. Low and gravelly and menacing. I froze. I mean, what's the protocol when a pensioner has gotten out of bed in the middle of the night for the second night running to mess with you? I sat there paralyzed, more paralyzed than I already was because of my legs. I was suddenly aware of my sense of vulnerability. I was completely immobile. It's not like I could get up and leave or something. I was stuck in my bed with heavy bandages and braces around both of my legs, hooked up to an IV. I slowly moved my hand down from my phone to push the call button for the nurses. Just as my hand reached it, the long groaning of my name stopped, and so had my hand. Had he seen me reach out for it and gone back to bed? No, he was still there. About 30 seconds passed by, presumably the length of time it took him to notice I was not going to press the button yet. Then came the heavy breathing, low rasping intakes of air, followed by extending groans to expel it, over and over, right from underneath the foot of my bed. That was my limit. I hit the call button and the light went on above my head. I heard the buzzer sound down the hallway at the nurse's station. There was a burst of movement behind my curtains, and I heard the nearby toilet door quickly open and close. Not long after, a nurse responded. Mick was still in the toilet, but because it was close by, I beckoned the nurse nearer so I could whisper. I told her what was going on this night and the previous, and asked if something could be done. She nodded and said she'd be right back. While she was gone, Mick emerged from the toilet. I heard him quietly crawl back into his bed and pretend to be asleep. Thankfully, the nurse had fully closed my curtains, so at least he could not see me now. An hour passed by, and eventually the nurse returned. I was expecting to be moved elsewhere, but instead she told me I couldn't have a sleeping pill due to being on morphine. I tried my best not to be impolite. I calmly told her I had not asked for a pill. I asked for something to be done about Mick. The last thing I wanted in this situation was to knock myself unconscious with even more meds. She just sort of shrugged and half explained that all of the wards were full. Then she disappeared, telling me to get some rest. Needless to say, I could not sleep for hours. Mick's snoring eventually resumed, and the day finally caught up with me. I cautiously allowed myself to drift off. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Mick made small talk, which I didn't really respond to, and eventually left me alone. That afternoon, a guy younger than me was admitted with a broken leg as well. This guy was 18 but looked about 12. It was absolutely ridiculous. Mick didn't seem to think so though. Suddenly, this guy was the focus of all his attention. I felt sorry for the fresh meat, but grateful I might be able to relax now. That night, I slept pretty well, until about 3 a.m. I was suddenly awoken to the weird sensation on my left foot, the toes of which were poking out of the top of my bandages. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw Mick standing there inside of my drawn curtains, playing with my toes, running his fingers along them, brushing them, pinching them, moving them around, like he'd wanted me to wake up and see what he was doing. He was not looking at my feet though. He was staring me dead in the eyes, unblinking. I'd like to say I lost my shit with him, called the nurses in and had him moved elsewhere immediately. But the mind's a weird thing, so that's not what I did. I just sat there open-mouthed and watched him as he kept rubbing his hands along my feet. I think it was disbelief that kept me quiet, mixed with fear of what he would do. He might have had more than 40 years on me, but I was completely trapped and totally at his mercy. Needless to say, I didn't want to do anything to piss him off. Eventually, he seemed to get tired of messing with me and disappeared behind the curtains once more. For obvious reasons, I sat awake for the rest of the night, watching and waiting for him to show his face again. Every now and then, I could hear my name being groaned out. By morning, it was a mixture of furious and terrified. I'm not the kind of person who assumes the role of victim very often, so I hated how easily this old man had reduced me to a paranoid wreck. Every time he got up to stretch his legs or get some water, my entire body would go rigid, expecting him to appear at my bedside once more. Instead, he went back to devoting all of this creepy attention to the new guy again. That afternoon, Mick was called away for a scan, so I finally had some time to speak to the 3 other guys in the room about what had happened. None of them had any idea about Mick's nightly visits. One of the guys had been there a lot longer than I had, though. He had been around when the wards were divided by gender. I asked him about what had happened. To cause this. He responded that he wasn't totally sure. He just knew that something had happened during the night, and the very next morning everyone had been in separate wards. For obvious reasons, I had a pretty good idea of what that something might have been. When Mick got back, he glumly announced he had been cleared to go home, and had an ambulance booked to take him there in an hour or two. He started making his way around the ward, saying goodbye to everyone, and he left me till the very last. He placed his hand on my foot. You look after those legs in the future. They're fragile things, you know. I half smiled and told him I hoped he felt better soon. I was assuming the interaction was the last one I'd have. I'd finally seen the last of this man. I picked up a magazine and started reading. No sooner than I had done that, though, I looked up. I was about to yell out until I saw what Mick was doing. His hand was clamped around my foot, squeezing it so hard his knuckles had gone white. Thankfully, this was not the area where the break was, or that might have seriously damaged me. After that, his stare was back, completely vacant. Before I could respond, his mouth opened, and out came the same raspy voice I'd heard saying my name in the night. They're very, very fragile. He let go of my foot and turned around, then shuffled back to his bed to pack. A couple of hours after that, he was finally gone. I did fill the nurses in before I was discharged, but none of them seemed to care all that much. They dismissed what I'd experienced as either partly drug-induced or just misinterpreted behavior.